color profiles. If you're working with your images for a time, you definitely have encountered color profiles. You know for sure sRGB if you're exported somehow for a website. Then you need the sRGB color profile. If you're working on a hardware calibrated screen, then you maybe have seen Adobe RGB. And if you maybe digged a little bit deeper inside Lightroom or into RAW files in general, then you maybe heard of ProPhoto RGB. And right now I want to show you the two profiles you should definitely know when to use it and how to use it if you're capable of using it. And that's Adobe RGB. If you want to use Adobe RGB, you need a screen that supports Adobe RGB. If not, then there's no point in using Adobe RGB. So let's go over here inside my Color Sync utility. And inside the Color Sync utility, I can compare different profiles. And right now, I have sRGB here opened. And this is the color space in the web, that's sRGB. And here on top you see Adobe RGB. And now I can press this small icon over here and hold for a comparison and give or let sRGB get rendered inside Adobe RGB. And now you see sRGB is a lot smaller than Adobe RGB. So the colorful inside is sRGB, and here outside, this gray one, this is Adobe RGB. And you see Adobe RGB is much bigger here for the greens, and here for the reds and blues, they're more or less the same. But for the greens, Adobe RGB is a lot bigger. And if you have a screen that can show Adobe RGB, then it's good that you're working with Adobe RGB. But remember, in the end, you will export your final file for sRGB most of the time if you're going to use your image on a website or on a social media platform. That's always this small one here. This is always sRGB. If you go for a printing workflow, then you have to use profiles that you're printing on. So in my case, this image over here, I printed on an Epson glossy photo paper, and I had to dial in the correct profile when I do the printing or when I send the files over to my printer. But only then. Before, I was working all the time on my Adobe RGB workflow and everything was fine. But when I go to the print, I will send over the Adobe RGB files to my printer. I'm working on an Epson SCP900, yes. And the printer takes the Adobe RGB files, and because I set the paper profile on the printer, my printer knows exactly what paper is inside the printing tray and converts the color so they are fine for the final print on my printer on this paper right here. And because the paper profile is most of the time smaller than the screen profile, most of the time and in the most values, then you have the possibility to see all the colors on your screen, and the printer will calculate so that you get the most out of the print. Let's say it this way. But you also have the possibility to do a soft proofing, and I will demonstrate this a little bit later, how you can set up your software, Photoshop or Lightroom, to prove, to simulate the paper capabilities. So what's possible for the printer to print onto the paper, and you want to see this on your screen. This is soft proofing, and we will see, or I will demonstrate this to you a little bit later. So just for you as a small reference, when you're working and when you have the hardware which is capable of Adobe RGB, I use an ISO monitor, and there it's possible to work in Adobe RGB because my screen can view Adobe RGB. If you're not working on a big screen, or on a more expensive graphical correct screen, then I would recommend to go with sRGB, because all of the screens are capable of sRGB. So that's the smallest common denominator, I think it's called. And then you are good to go, because in your workflow you see the colors, you work on the colors you are seeing, and then you can send the colors over to the internet. Then you are in the same workspace. Or when you send it over for printing, then the printer will handle the conversion, because sRGB is not so big color space that have to be converted inside the final profile for the print, or for the paper in this case. So this was just a small introduction to color profiles, and now you know it a little bit better, and you will see, if you're looking close, you have a lot of options in the software to set up what you have or what you want to work with, sRGB or Adobe RGB. And when you send your final deliveries to the printer, or to a printing agency, or to a printing company, or to a photo book production company, then you have to decide on which profile you want to send these files over.